So let's jump into this a little bit about whether there is genetic basis for behavior and whether they are inheritable genetically. This article looks at how genes should be can be used for medical research and behavioral research, and I mentioned gut microbiome for depression, and Robert Sapolsky from Stanford talks about how brain circuitry can affect rewards behavior, depression, and other things. And of course, there are also arguments about whether abusive behavior is inherited. All sorts of details are there. But this one looks for correlation. So genetic correlation with educational attainment. So body mass index related ideas. So there are negative correlations, body fat percentage, coronary artery diseases, type 2. We know that these diseases are definitely inherited, and we know that type 2 diabetes can be behavior related, not exercising, being overweight, eating too much. Being overweight may be genetic, but it can be acquired in one generation as well as an anatomical change due to lack of exercise or eating junk food and bad food and so on and so forth. So once, let's say I got diabetes too, even though my parents didn't have it, then am I likely to pass it on? There is evidence that the probability goes up quite a bit when your parents are diabetic, type 2, for example. So those are the things that are looked at in terms of correlations here. So HDL and LDL have opposite genetic correlation. Childhood correlation, birth weight, childhood IQ has a fairly high significant correlation in terms of inheritability. Childhood obesity has a small negative correlation. Infant head circumference, well, obviously we are getting into a little bit danger there, but again, fertility, age of first birth, age of menopause, number of children ever born. There are lots of psychiatric genetic correlates which obviously would be very helpful for healthcare if these can be used to study genetic dependence and heritability, inheritability, without getting into crazy things about branding people. And so on. So Alzheimer's disease, and there are detailed questions as well. If Alzheimer's mostly makes an appearance when you are older, then is it an age-related disease? If so, can it really be genetically passed on? Because by that age, you have already gone past your breeding stage. But on the other hand, is it already there, imprinted in the genes that expresses itself as at a different age? And if there are environmental factors that make its appearance possible. Autism, bipolar disorder, and so on. Smoking related, there are negative correlates. I'm not saying in detail what the positive and negative correlations mean and how they are computed, but you can look at this paper. I just wanted to use this to raise issues that this idea of behavior, development and evolution are obviously interrelated, but the question of whether behavior is genetic or not continues to be debated. And there are various other miscellaneous things, including whether one is a morning person, celiac, height. Obviously height is very closely related to genetic inheritance. Heart rate, rheumatoid arthritis, father's age at death, mother's age at death, height correlates here, and so on. So obviously things like altruism have been debated as something that is learned from religion, from culture, hence it can be lost because it's a learned behavior. And the question is whether evolutionarily altruism can be stable behavior, because if you're altruistic and not working to protect yourself and your family, because you're being too altruistic, then will that gene really propagate, or will it be eliminated soon? Okay. Transitioning then into what would make us modern humans in that sense, one can use the DNA basis to say modern DNA actually goes back 260,000 to 350,000 years ago. So as far back as that period, modern brain size was already big enough. So it was already there in our ancestors, as well as we talked about in terms of Neanderthals and so on. So the timelines, obviously we keep switching back and forth, but just track it. Various abilities like language, art, music, spirituality, dance, storytelling, marriage, warfare, biparental care, etc. were already present here more than 260,000 years ago. So the idea of whether humans are basically monogamous or they like serial monogamy or they are polygamous, and all those debates go on, and whether marriage and biparental care, etc., are related much more to the evolution of agriculture in the Holocene, or they were existing before, and whether they are related to DNA, just in terms of, for example, how long humans stay in charge of the child. Many animals have give birth and then either they abandon the child and walk away, or they are there for a very short time. The longest association tends to be among primates and humans, of course. So there are speciations that happened along the way. So the southern Khoisan Bushmen, northern Khoisan Bushmen, ghost modern species in West Africa, Central African Pygmies, East Africans, and then the out of Africa into European, Asian, Amerindians, Aboriginal Australians, and so on. So here you have evolution of boats, bows, needles, representational art. Does it represent any change in the brain morphology, brain neural connection, brain size, neocortex growing, and so on? It's not always clear. Fish hook gets invented here 17 to 19,000 years ago, just before the end of the last ice age. Spear thrower comes along, which facilitates hunting big game from far away without getting in danger, and farming evolves around 10,000 years ago, and we'll revisit this soon, but quick in the next podcast. But was farming something related to climate, or was it related to the extinction of big mammals, and so on and so forth? So generally a great leap is assumed around 65,000 years ago with these inventions that rapidly allowed us to build societies with hunting, sharing, cooperating, languages allowing communication, trading, whether trading and homogenization of languages is related to climate. For example, does a rainy place have a lot of self-dependent or independent tribes that grow separate languages, and drier climate makes trading necessary, and hence languages begin to get homogenized, and so on and so forth. So whether this great leap made us modern, and whether that is independent of the genetic signatures we were carrying, whether that is related to brain size, and whether the brain size itself responds to how much it is used. We will see at the end of this chapter that there is some evidence that in fact brain is a use it or lose it kind of an organ. The more you use it, some things do get sharper and better. So that's also something we have to remember. And the brain size evolution, as I mentioned briefly before, may itself have been related to mastering fire as well. Excuse me. Looking at a putative general outline for the development of human fire use, showing its emergence from and interchanges with natural wildfire. All boundaries can be regarded as highly fluid. It's highly likely that there are different fire histories on different latitudes and continents. So here is time and here is natural fire. At some point, anthropogenic fire, human controlled initiated fire comes into existence, and there are opportunistic, conserved and limited, modern and kindled. So it's possible that natural fires used to happen, and humans or our ancestors noticed that that tended to congregate animals to run away from fire, which then they figured is a good way to hunt by pushing them with fire, or accidentally cooked fruits, vegetables, meat, for example, and realizing that's easier to chew. So molar structures changed, jaw muscles changed, that allowed the brain size to change. So if you look at longer timelines in terms of emergence of the hominins, last common ancestor goes back to more than 6 million years ago. Then you have chimpanzees and bonobos here, where we diverged and became hominins. So we have Ardipithecus australopithecines here, and Homo lineage evolved more than 2 million years ago. Then you had technologies coming along like stone technology, wood, fire evidence, less than 2 million years ago, and inferred languages before that, just starting before that. These are of course evidences subject to change because of newer evidences emerging from caves, or climate change sometimes drops sea level and new information emerges, and so on and so forth. Okay, so fire would have probably played a role in our evolution, behavioral change, cooperational change, maybe potentially gut size change because of cooked food, jaw muscle change as well, and cranium change, and that may in turn would have fed back to behavioral change as well. So the other thing that we have to slowly combine with this is the diaspora itself, which is the focus of the next chapter, but I wanted to touch on that here as well. So if we go back to Homo sapiens in Africa, 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, modern DNA of course goes back much further in terms of shared genetic material. So Europe is much later, evidence around 45,000 years ago. Levant and the Arabian Peninsula, 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. This is a News and Views article on Axel Timmermann's older paper, which used climate simulations to argue when out of Africa migrations happened and push the timelines back. So North Asia seems to be around 20,000 years ago, Americas around 15,000 years ago, like the Clovids for example, South Asia, Indonesia and Australia 50,000 years ago, and associated with these there are extinctions. So if you look at mammalian large megafaunal extinctions, the number is minimal here because humans ancestors co-evolved with animals, so they didn't battle each other too much. But when they colonized new places, they hunted down or eliminated megafauna as threat or for food. So extinction numbers are much higher in other places, but of course there are also climate signals associated with those. So remembering then by 15,000 years ago we have colonized much of the planet. Holocene arrives with the disappearance of the last ice age, which peaked around 21,000 years ago. Then the question is whether we evolved as agriculturalists because of climate change or by accident, or there was some other driver that made it happen, and then what it meant once we became agriculturalists in terms of family structures, going from hunter-gatherers, wanderers to settling down, population increasing, fertility increasing, behavioral changes. So we have to always come back to behavioral change as well. So we'll leave this here and come back and look a little bit more at some evidence of Neanderthals having battled human beings during their lifetime. So there is co-breeding, interbreeding happening, obviously communication happening, and it is possible that modern humans came into Europe and just interbred so much that Neanderthal DNA completely got merged with modern humans, or there were lots of conflicts and they got wiped out because their brain was bigger but they were not as smart, and so on. And whether the question again is whether increased cognitive abilities do come with more aggression. Okay.